No, but really, how do you see the world around you? Maybe you think that your upbringing or your biology already make this decision for you? However, there may be several different factors working in the background that play into this worldview. Throughout this video, you will learn that culture, your level of cultural competence, stereotypes, and diversity all play a major role in your outlook of your demographic, your education, and your community. They may even be connected in some ways. Now, although culture may seem like a pretty common term, do we really even know what it means? Well, the book says when referring to a group of people as a culture, we are applying the term to the dominant culture found in most societies. But that kind of leads to the question, what is the dominant culture? Well, it says the dominant culture clearly indicates that the group we are referring to generally exercises the greatest influence on the beliefs, values, perceptions, communication patterns, and customs of the culture. What does that mean for us? What does that mean for Americans? Well, that may be an exaggeration or a stereotype, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Okay, so the dominant culture, or the mainstream culture as we like to call it in America. This doesn't always mean that it's the majority of the citizens' belief within a society, and it doesn't even mean it's the best or most moral. But the main points of America's dominant culture I'd like to touch on is religion and language. It may not come as a surprise to anyone that America's most spoken language is, drumroll please, English. In 2011, the Census Bureau lists 230 million Americans in the category of speaking only English at home, and this doesn't even include bilinguals. Clearly, this language is part of our dominant culture. Now, back to religion. According to Robert S. Elwood, in his book Religious and Spiritual Groups in Modern America, America sees itself as a Christian nation, established by God-fearing patriots and flourishing under divine protection. As such, it continues to have one of the highest rates of church attendance, mostly in conventional Christian denominations, of any Christian country in the world. The Bible still remains a bestseller, and according to opinion polls, the majority of Americans, largely conventional Christians, say their religious faith is important to them. This really isn't even that hard to see in our own communities. I mean, take a look around Owensboro. It's really not that hard to determine what the dominant culture is, especially when it comes to religion. So by this point, I'm sure you're like, I get it. Dominant culture is a big deal, but what does this tell us about a worldview? Well, I'm here to tell you what it means. We like to think that our decisions are our own, but are they? Of course, we all have our freedom of speech and clearly the right to our own opinions, but it would be difficult to say that these dominant cultures, especially when it comes to language and religion, don't have a huge influence. It tells us that, like I said at the beginning of this video, our demographic, our education, and our community have the most to do with it. Can this be a negative thing or a positive thing? Well, it can really be both. It is easy at times to try and force the dominant culture of a society onto those who aren't in it or are practicing the dominant culture, otherwise known as subcultures, because isn't that the point of dominant culture, to control certain characteristics? See, these characteristics can either tear us apart from those who we think are different from us, or we can celebrate these differences and try to understand the other cultures as best that we can. What is that called again? Something like cultural competence? Unlike the term culture, cultural competence is a rarely used concept in today's society, even though we use it, or we should be using it, every single day of our lives. Cultural competence has to do with our interactions that we have with those with different cultures. It's us as individuals doing our best to understand, relate, and communicate our own culture to others outside of our culture. As we all know, there are oftentimes barriers between cultures, which can come from language differences or unfamiliar practices. Intercultural competence is the act of tearing those barriers down. But sadly, if we don't have intercultural competence, then we have misunderstandings. Listen, I get it. It's hard to have cultural competence sometimes. So I, and the textbook of course, are here to give you a few tips on how to increase your cultural competence. So if you're ever in a situation where you're interacting with someone from a different culture, first, be mindful. Understand that you need to watch your speech rate and your specific vocabulary. Speak slowly and try to avoid over-complicated language. Along with this, be aware of the other person's non-verbal communication. If they don't understand you, chances are they will show that with their body language. So make sure you're checking to make sure that there are no misunderstandings. That way you can have high intercultural competence. But what does this tell us about a worldview? A worldview in which understanding is at the forefront of our minds. When communicating with anyone, especially those of other cultures, our main objective should always be to understand that person and strive to have that person understand us. With this effective communication comes a better grasp of not only individuals, but our world as a whole. Stereotypes. We may all like to claim we don't stereotype, and we wouldn't dare associate ourselves with any form of the word. But really, if you look at what stereotyping is and where it came from, it's simply our minds categorizing people or people groups in an organized manner so that we can relate to them. So does this mean that stereotypes are a good thing or a bad thing? Well, turns out it means neither, or both. Either way, we can over-stereotype. Here's a little video just to give you an example.
Hey, you're pretty blonde. You must be really popular and not very smart.
What he doesn't know is, I'm actually not that popular, but I am pretty smart. Along with this, as I said on my discussion board post for level 1, I've been a vegetarian for over a year now, and there are a lot of stereotypes that come along with this, even if it's simply a diet. However, again, it's simply people's way of categorizing others within their society. Because as it states in the book, stereotyping is a complex form of categorization that mentally organizes your experiences with and guides your behavior toward a particular group of people. That doesn't sound so bad. However, if you are placing hatred on an entire people group or culture due to one person's actions, that's when misogyny, racism, and overall misunderstandings occur. So what does that tell us about a worldview? Stereotypes basically give us a representation of just how complex our world truly is. With hundreds of countries, religions, languages, and beliefs, it's hard to even wrap our minds around the overwhelming amount of variety. And this variety isn't just on the other side of the world, it's within our own communities. Due to this complexity that is so relevant within our everyday family, education, and business life, we have to find some way to organize these different concepts of the world into groups, since seeing each person or people group with individualism would be virtually impossible, even if we do all deserve to be represented as the unique beings that we are. It is when we overgeneralize the characteristics of an entire people group, especially when these characteristics have negative connotations, that's when the problem arises. So use stereotypes, but remember to keep in mind that one definition will never fit two people. And last but certainly not least, diversity. Lately, this topic has come up a lot in media, politics, and honestly, everyday conversation. Diversity is one of the reasons the world really is so complex. But it also is one of the reasons the world has so much conflict as well. As a fundamental rule, people don't like their views to be challenged, and that's what diversity does, challenges us to see things from a different perspective. So we're all different, right? We grew up in different households, we hold different values that are important to us, and we all see the world from a totally different point of view. This does not mean any one of us is living the right way or any one of us is living the wrong way, but each one of us bring a different perspective that's useful. See, we are different, but in the end we all come together to make up one society, to make up one culture. Also, side note, I thought it was really ironic how each color was kind of representing a form of culture, and I accidentally poured too much purple dye into the glass, and the purple color kind of dominated the rest of the other colors, kind of like a dominant culture dominates over all other cultures. Okay, back to the video. And I think diversity can sometimes be used as a term only to describe a race or ethnicity, but it can actually be attributed to anything that sets us apart from one another. Our sexual orientation, our gender, age, all of these things represent diversity. But how can we all be so different but still work together?
Isn't it like so cool how you're wearing a blue shirt and I'm wearing a red shirt, yet we can still respect each other's differences to make up a functioning and a respectful society?
Okay, that may be oversimplifying it just a bit, but I think you get the picture. Diversity doesn't have to be a complication, it can be an advantage. Oh, and what's that question we've been asking again? So what does that tell us about a worldview? Diversity means that our worldview doesn't have to be so boring. We can look around and take pride in the fact that we'll never be exactly like someone else, and no one else will be exactly like us. That does mean at times that there's going to be miscommunication, especially when it comes to someone who is vastly different from us. Seeing this as an opportunity to learn, rather than a burden on our lives, changes the way in which we see the world. See, that's a great thing. We don't all have to be identical to live and work in a functioning society. We can be productive in our own individual ways to ultimately construct a progressive culture. Clearly, each one of these things affect our worldview, but how does it all tie in together? Well, if you think about it, it's really not that difficult to see how it's all connected. Let's think of it like this. We all live in a society that contains a culture. That culture contains diversity, which then leads us to use stereotypes. But we still need to use our cultural competence to have an educated worldview that will then lead us to a harmonious society, even if we do see the world just a little bit differently from each other. So, how do you see the world?